He was large for his age. His face was pale. When Miss Jane took off his cap, I noticed he had black curly hair. His arms hung limply at his sides. Miss Jane helped him off with his coat. He seemed to be uncooperative. She hung up his hat and coat in his locker. As she came up to me, she said quietly, "Well, there is Dibs. He would never take off his coat and hat by himself, so now we do it routinely. Sometimes we try to get him to join one of the other children in some activity or give him something specific to do, but he rejects all our offers. This morning, we'll just let him alone and you can see for yourself what he will do. He may stand there for a long, long time, or he may start to move from one thing to another. Sometimes he flirts from one thing to another as though he had no attention span at all. Then again, he will focus on something for an hour. It all depends on how he feels." Miss Jane went over to some of the other children. I observed Dibs, trying not to seem to be focusing my attention upon him. He stood there. Then he turned, very slowly and deliberately. He raised his hands in an almost futile gesture of despair, then dropped them down to his sides. He turned again. Now I was in his range of vision, if he cared to look at me. He sighed, bit his lip, stood there. One little boy ran up to Dibs. "Hi, Dibs," he said. "Come play." Dibs stuck out at the boy. He would have scratched him, but the little boy jumped back quickly. "Cat, cat, cat," teased the boy. Miss Jane came over and told the boy to go to the other part of the room and play. Dibs moved over to the wall, near a small table on which were some stones, shells, pieces of coal, and other minerals. Dibs stood beside the table. Slowly, he picked up first one object and then another. He ran his fingers around them, touched his cheek with them, smelled them, tasted them. Then he replaced them carefully. He glanced in my direction. It was a fleeting look toward me, then quickly away. He got down, crawled under the table, and sat there, almost completely out of sight. Then I noticed the other children were bringing their chairs up in a small circle around one of the teachers. It was time for the children to show the others what they had brought to school and to tell some bit of news that was important to them. The teacher told them a story. They sang a few songs. Dibs, under the table, was not too far away. From his vantage point, he could hear what they were saying and see what they were showing, if he wanted to. Had he anticipated this activity of the group when he crawled under the table? It was difficult to say. He stayed under the table until the morning circle broke up and the children went to the other activities. Then he too moved on to something else. He crawled around the room, staying close to the wall, stopping to examine many things he came upon. When he came to the wide windowsill where the terrarium and aquarium were, he climbed up beside them and gazed steadily into the big square glass containers. Occasionally, he would reach in and touch something in the terrarium. Then his touch seemed deft and light. He stayed there for half an hour, seemingly absorbed in his observation. Then he crawled on, completing his trip around the room. Some things he touched quickly and carefully, then passed on to something else. When he came to the book corner, he fingered the books on the table, selected one, took a chair, dragged it across the room to a corner, and sat down on it, facing the wall. He opened the book at the beginning and slowly examined every page, turning the leaves carefully. Was he reading? Was he even looking at the pictures? One of the teachers went over to him. "Oh, I see," she said. "You're looking at the bird book. Do you want to tell me about it, Dibs?" she inquired in a gentle, kindly voice. Dibs hurled the book away from him. He threw himself down on the floor and lay stiff and rigid, face down, immobilized. "I'm sorry," the teacher said. "I didn't mean to bother you, Dibs." She picked up the book, put it back on the table, walked over to me. "Now that was typical," she said. "We have learned not to bother him, but I wanted you to see." Dibs, in his prone position, had turned his head so that he could watch the teacher. We pretended not to be observing him. Finally, he got up and walked slowly around the edge of the room. He touched the paints, crayons, clay, nails, hammer, wood, drum, cymbals. He picked them up and put them down again. The other children went about their business without too much concern for Dibs. He avoided any physical contact with them and they let him alone. Then it was time to go out and play. One of the teachers told me, "Maybe he will, maybe he won't. I wouldn't bet a nickel either way." She announced that it was time to go out and play. She asked Dibs if he wanted to go out. He said, "No, go out," in a flat, heavy tone. I said I thought I would go out. It was such a nice day. I put on my coat. Suddenly Dibs said, "Dibs, go out." The teacher put his coat on for him. He walked clumsily out into the play yard. His coordination was very poor. It was as though he was all tied up in knots, physically as well as emotionally. The other children played in the sandbox, on the swings, on the jungle gym, on the bicycles. They played ball, catch, hide and seek. They ran, skipped, climbed, jumped, but not Dibs. He walked off to a remote corner, picked up a little stick, squatted down and scratched it back and forth in the dirt. Back and forth, making little grooves in the dirt, not looking at anyone, staring down at the stick and the ground, hunched over this lonely activity, silent, withdrawn, remote. We decided that when the children came back into the room and after their rest period, I would take Dibs down to the playroom at the end of the hall, if he would go with me. When the teacher rang the bell, the children all came in, even Dibs. Miss Jane helped him off with his coat. He handed her his cap this time. The teacher put a record of soft, relaxing music on the phonograph. Each child got out his mat, stretched out on the floor for the rest period. Dibs got out his mat and unrolled it. He put his mat under the library table, a distance away from the other children. He lay face down on his mat, put his thumb in his mouth, rested with the other children. What was he thinking about in his lonely little world? What were his feelings? Why did he behave in this manner? What had happened to the child to cause this kind of withdrawal from people? Could we manage to get through to him? After rest period, the children put away their mats. Dibs rolled his mat up and put it away in the correct space on the shelf. The children were dividing into smaller groups. One group would have a work period and build things out of lumber. Another group would paint or play with clay.